On behalf of Washington Hebrew and all of the clergy, I am excited to welcome you to this program. We are blessed to have with us Rabbi Laura Geller this evening. She comes to us through our partnership with the Jewish Book Council. As you can see, she wrote a book, Getting Good at Getting Older. And I have my copy right here. And it's a great read, actually. I highly recommend it, and we will be giving you the link to that many times throughout the evening. And in addition to our relationship with the Jewish Book Council, this program this evening is sponsored by our Joyful Living program, which is a program led by our Wise Aging facilitators. And it is a program that has cohorts starting in December. So we thank them for sponsoring this program. And if you enjoy this program, I certainly invite you to sign up for the next Joyful Living cohort. There will be both evening and morning options for the next Joyful Living cohort. So with that, I would like to let you know a little bit about our guest. Rabbi Laura Geller is the Rabbi Emerita of Temple Emanuel in Beverly Hills, and she is twice named one of Newsweek's 50 most influential rabbis in America. And she was named by PBS Next Avenue as one of the 50 2017 influencers. Prior to becoming one of the first women to be selected through a national search to lead a major metropolitan synagogue, Rabbi Geller served as the director of Hillel of University of Southern California for 14 years, and as the Pacific Southwest region's executive director of the American Jewish Congress for 4 years. She was featured in a PBS documentary, Jewish Americans. She is the author of numerous articles in books and journals, and Rabbi Geller was on the editorial board of The Torah, a women's commentary, which, for those of you who join us on Saturday morning at our Torah study, and I know many of you here do join us, it is one of my favorite commentaries to use in that class. She serves as a fellow of the Corporation of Brown University, from where she graduated in 1971. In addition, she serves on the boards of Encore.org and the Jewish Women's Archives. She was ordained by Hebrew Union College in 1976, and she is the third woman in the Reform movement to become a rabbi. She is a proud step-parent and parent and grandparent, and we are thrilled to have her this evening. And so I introduce to you Rabbi Laura Geller.
Well, it's lovely to meet all of you, and thank you for inviting me not only into your synagogue, but also into your homes.
And with that introduction, we begin with a melody. On Shabbat, as we welcome in Shabbat, we sing Psalm 92. And in Psalm 92, we read that the righteous bloom like a date palm. They thrive like a cedar in Lebanon, which I think is a beautiful image for those of us as we are aging, as the years span out ahead of us, that we thrive and we bloom. And so I invite you to share in this melody with me. I'll sing the Hebrew words, but if you would like to sing on lai 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 or whatever nonsense word you come up with, yai yai yai, woo 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 on oohs, that's fine. So we join together. Tzadikata ma'ifrach ke'erez balvanon iskeh shetuli beveit Adonai bechatzrot Eloheinu yafrichu odinun beseva deshenim verananim yehu lehagid ki yashar And so we turn to Rabbi Geller. Rabbi Geller, so what brought you to this book?
So first of all, that was beautiful. And those words mean a lot to me. In the fullness of age, may you still be fruitful, full of sap and freshness. One of my favorite Psalm verses. So there are actually two origin stories of the book. The first connects me to my congregation. I was 62 years old, beginning to think about my next stage. And I gave a sermon called, Will You Still Need Me When I'm 64? I wasn't really worried about losing my hair or whether somebody would still need me or feed me when I was 64. But I did notice that a huge percentage of congregants were boomers, and many of them were leaving the congregation. That sermon led to a listening campaign where we talked to about 250 congregants between the ages of, let's say, 60 and early 80s in people's homes. And we asked them how they feel about this stage of life, the stage between maturity, when they built their families and their careers, and frail old age. It turns out that this is a new stage of life that didn't exist for our grandparents, because all of us are now living approximately 30 years longer than people did a century ago, thanks to advances in medicine, education, and science. But these years are not tacked on to the end of our lives, but in the middle, between midlife and frail old age, a whole life stage our grandparents never experienced. So in this listening campaign, we asked, there's extra years that have been added to your life. How will you add extra life to those years? And we asked people what gets them up in the morning, what their hopes are, and what keeps them up at night. What are their concerns? The fears, the concerns that emerged, very clear. People were fearful of becoming invisible. Who am I when I'm not the senior rabbi of Temple Emanuel anymore? People were afraid of becoming isolated, noticing that their social capital kind of constricts when they're no longer working, they're no longer driving carpool. Being alone was a fear. Being without purpose. Well, what am I going to do all day? And becoming dependent. God forbid I should ever be dependent, particularly on my children. So those were the fears people had. Lots of issues emerged in these conversations. As our community is changing and friends move away, kids do too, with whom do I want to grow older? And in what kinds of settings? Do I want to move to a retirement community? Do I want to age in place? So these conversations, many for the first time. Lots of conversations about relationships. How do I navigate changing relationships with friends? How do I nurture long-term connections? How do I let go of toxic friendships? You know, I recognize that there's less time ahead than there is behind, and I don't want to be troubled by relationships that suck energy from me. I want to surround myself with relationships that are supportive and help me grow. Some of us were dealing with older parents. How do we take care of our older parents? How do we become parents to our parents? Others of us dealing with millennial children, some of whom had come home to live, and some of us both dealing with older parents and millennial children. There was talk about how relationships with intimate partners change as we grow older. So a whole series of conversations around relationships. And then there were the questions, what do I have to do now? Right now I'm 70, to become the 85-year-old I someday hope to be. You know, that scene in When Harry Met Sally, and it's Estelle Reiner who looks and says, I want what she's having, right? Well, many of us are fortunate to know a much older person, and we want to be like that much older person. Well, what do I need to do now? What kinds of character traits do I need to work on now in order for me to become that person? And how can Jewish tradition and Jewish wisdom help me develop those character traits? One of the things that we learned in our research is that all of the data about growing older indicates that the kinds of character traits that correlate to healthy and joyful living and joyful aging is the character trait of gratitude, of forgiveness, equanimity, patience. And it turns out that Jewish tradition doesn't only say these are things that are important, but it actually gives us spiritual practices that we can be working on now that will help us kind of strengthen those muscles as we grow older. We also raised questions about illness. How do I deal with illness? Now, illness, many of us have dealt with that at different stages of our life, different levels of disability. But it is true that as we grow older, it becomes often more a part of many of our lives. So how do I deal with illness, my own or that of my friends? How do I be a good friend to a friend who's sick? Then there were questions, what do I need to do to get ready for the inevitable? People recognized that as far as we know, the death rate is holding steady at 100%. All of us will someday die. But it's something that we are in denial about, many of us. And how do we have those important end-of-life conversations so that when the moment comes, those people who we love, either our adult children or other people, know what we would want? How do we have those conversations? It turns out that at Temple Emanuel, the majority of our congregants had prepared end-of-life directives, but a very, very small percentage of them had ever really shared them with their adult children. And I'm sure that Cantor Bordnick and your rabbis can share my experience, which is I've sat in way too many hospital rooms where a beloved or not so beloved mother or father are no longer able to articulate their own needs, and the adult children are fighting with each other about what mom or dad would have wanted. Those kinds of conversations destroy families and really could be avoided if we could figure out a way to have those conversations. What will give meaning to my life, people ask, now that I no longer work full time? How can I find a volunteer or a paid position to which I can bring my experience, my talent, my passion? Series of questions that really clustered around the question, how can I live a legacy as well as leave a legacy? So these kinds of conversations became the table of contents for the book. Getting good at gaining wisdom is the first section. What does Jewish tradition tell us about these kinds of practices that can help us gain wisdom? Getting good at getting along, all the different questions related to relationships. Getting good at getting better, taking care of our physical health, our emotional health, our psychological health. It includes, by the way, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg workout regime. Getting good at getting ready. Those conversations. Thinking about our funerals. Getting good at giving back. And getting good at giving away. So those became the structure of the book. We wrote the book. My late husband and I wrote the book together, but many of the chapters were written by people who had particular expertise in specific areas in the book. And the book is a toolkit. It is not a sermon. It doesn't just say, treasure each moment, number your days. It actually gives you tools and resources for how to deal with the specific challenges that we might be facing. Millennial kids coming home to live, what kinds of rules should you set? What kinds of questions do you ask? Do they pay rent? The book doesn't tell you what the answers are, but it raises questions to help you think through whatever these transitional situations might be. The section on friendship doesn't offer traditional text about friendship, but rather specifically, how do you make a new friend? How do you let go of toxic friendship? So again, it's a toolkit, not a sermon. So that's the first origin story of the book. The second relates to my late husband, Richard Siegel, who in his 20s was a co-author of a book called The Jewish Catalog. Now, how many of you remember the Jewish Catalog? Raise your hand. So if we had more time, I would ask you to tell me what it is that you remember about the Jewish Catalog. It was a pretty significant book, a toolkit for how we in the 60s and 70s could take back Judaism from it says in the introduction, the staid hands of our elders, and create a Judaism that really speaks to our experience as young Jews. That was the Jewish Catalog. It got the attention of the Jewish community to pay attention to young adults. Until then, young adults were pretty invisible in the structures of the Jewish community in the 60s and in the 70s. Well, now that very same generation of people that read the Jewish Catalog in those days, we're in our 60s and 70s, and we need another toolkit to help us deal with these changes in our lives. Some of you are maybe even baked challah for the first time with the challah recipe in the Jewish Catalog. Getting good at getting older does for us now what the Jewish Catalog did for us then. And like with the Jewish Catalog, it does it with a sense of humor. The book has the same structure as the Jewish Catalog, and there are little cartoons, and there are even some photographs, including my favorite, which is the backside of Maxine Menster's Tombstone in Ohio, which is a recipe for cookies. Apparently, every time someone asked Maxine for her cookie recipe, she would say, "Over my dead body." So that is why we wrote the book. And unfortunately, my husband Rich, in the process of writing it, came ill and died before the book was finished.
Thank you. I'm so sorry to hear of your husband's passing. I hope that writing the book did help you perhaps come to terms with his death in a different way. To have worked on this with him must be so special to have that memory.
Really, and I mean, the truth is that because we had talked about everything for the writing of the book, we actually did have that conversation with our adult children, a blended family. We took them away on a vacation after Richie and I had filled out our end of life directives. We used a document called 5 Wishes, which is a really terrific version of an end of life directive. And we told our kids, all of whom are young millennials, a couple of them married, we said, we'll take you all on a vacation, but the cost of the vacation is to have the conversation. So my children learned that there's no such thing as a free lunch or a free vacation. And it was a very moving conversation, which actually led to our adult children saying, wow, give us these forms. We want to fill them out for ourselves. And then when Rich got sick, it was just so comforting to everybody to know that we were doing exactly what he wanted.
That's nice. That's nice. I'm glad you had that. I found it interesting that you called the book a toolkit, because in my mind, what came to me as I was reading it was a practical guidebook. So very similar thinking. And I love that you bring out the tombstone. I actually showed every member of my family the tombstone after reading that part. I thought it was hilarious. And some of the other epitaphs that are on some of the other tombstones, Shalom Aleichem and some of the other ones.
We did learn in writing the book that the secret to getting good at getting older is having a sense of humor. If you don't, forget it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned so many rituals, and you already mentioned some of them. And as the book is taking us through all of these different aspects of getting older, there were many rituals in here. You mentioned forgiveness being an important aspect of getting older, and being joyful, having a joyful living as we get older. And I noticed that you have a page dedicated to the forgiveness prayer, which is recited prior to Shema. And there are other practices of that are traditional Jewish practices of gratitude for when we see a friend after a long time, or something beautiful out in nature, or the blessing of our bodies working in the morning, which is not always a given as we age. So you also in the book, however, don't just rely on traditions that are already a part of Judaism, but actually there's a chapter that is dedicated to new rituals. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the practice of creating our own rituals.
Okay, first of all, Jean, can you hear me better now? Can you signal? Okay, Joyce and Jean are having trouble hearing me. Is anybody else? And can somebody help me with that?
Not too much better now. Maybe closer to a mic or something. I missed that last sentence you said before, and it was so important.
The one that the secret to getting good at getting older is having a sense of humor. Yeah,
That's the one.
Is this better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Better now? Okay,
Yes. Thank you.
I'll just lean closer to the computer, but please indicate by chatting if you're having trouble hearing. Okay. So it turns out that our tradition, as Susan just said, does suggest that divinity is present at every moment in our life. If we want to acknowledge that, some of us have different notions of what divinity means, but the notion in Judaism that we say 100 blessings a day, it means that we stop 100 times a day and we say, wow, seeing a friend, wow, seeing the ocean, wow, my body's working well, wow. I'm eating this apple. Wow, that is the tradition of saying 100 blessings a day. And one of the ways that we say blessings and mark transitions is through life cycle rituals. So it turns out to be true. Those of you that went to religious school in the olden days, if you were taking a class on the life cycle of a Jew, you would study Brit Milah. And then if you're born after 1972, you would also learn about a covenant ceremony for a daughter. And there would be a bat mitzvah or a bar mitzvah. And then there's a confirmation. And then there's a wedding. And then the next life cycle ritual after wedding is what? It's funeral, right? There's no life cycle rituals in this part of our lives. And the irony is that most likely many of us are going to live more years in the years between midlife or marriage or the beginning of that stage of our life and our funerals. But clearly this part of our life is also filled with moments that are important and need to be marked. Now, one of the things we learned from Jewish feminism in the 70s was my experience as a Jewish woman is Jewish experience. Even if the tradition didn't see it, we changed the tradition. And that's why the Cantor's manual that Susan was given at her ordination looked different from the rabbi's manual that I got, because by then there already were more rituals that acknowledged the experience of women. So learning from that, the question is, what are the moments in your life between maturity and frail old age that you could imagine marking with some kind of a ritual? So let's maybe take a minute and respond to that in the chat. What were some important moments? Maybe you did create rituals just instinctively. Maybe your synagogue has created some. What would those be? So let's take a minute and maybe, Susan, you might want to see if anybody wants to shout out an answer.
Sure, absolutely. I see a couple came in from Wendy Kosman and Jim Solander. Would you both like to unmute yourselves and share what you've shared in the chat?
I just thought of sickness and having grandchildren.
Okay, so the moment when you become a grandparent is a big moment, and it's a different moment for different people. Some of us, not me, unfortunately, are lucky enough to be in the same place as where our grandchildren are born, and we can be part of that welcoming. But some of us have grandkids that live in Portland. But still, when my grandchildren were born, how would I acknowledge that here with my friends here who are not going to Portland for the bris or the baby naming?
Right,
So
and I
what,
also, sorry.
so what kind of ritual would you do, and who would you do it with, and who would you do it at the synagogue? And, to think about that. Okay, so what are some others?
So, Jim, I noticed you put birthdays and anniversaries, and I would like to just add to yours, Jim, if you don't mind, how you always write a holiday letter as you give your honey that you have harvested yourself. And that's a ritual that you didn't put down that I actually appreciate every year. So, Jim, if there's anything you'd like to add to that, I know I stole your thunder by saying it out loud.
No, I wasn't even going to go there, but I was going to say that I think you can make, I mean, it's the idea of making it special, just as a blessing make you stop and think. So if a grandchild has a sixth birthday, you acknowledge it, or they start kindergarten, or I don't know. And we do this at the Friday night services periodically, or not periodically, do it every Friday night, but not everybody participates, about asking for the good things that happened during the week. And I think that there are lots of good things if we just stop to see them and make them special. It's sort of like, beauty is the art. It's the art of making things special when you decorate the cake as opposed to just putting the cake on the table. And so the conversation becomes special with the grandchild, or the birthday becomes special, or the anniversary becomes special.
So what's interesting is, if I were to say this to a more traditional audience, the response would be, well, there are no specific life cycle rituals for this stage of life because we relive them through our children, right? So, my bat mitzvah was when I was 13, but then my kids had their b'nai mitzvah when they were 13. So one way to think about this is the milestones of children and grandchildren, which is wonderful for those of us that have children and grandchildren, but it's important to acknowledge that not all of us do, and our experience is different. And I am both a mother and a grandmother, but I'm also, in many parts of my life, that's not the central focus of my life. So what are those other kinds of moments? So a major birthday is one. There is a tradition, a folk tradition, that a person has a second bar mitzvah, or a first one if you didn't get to have one when you turn 83. Why? Because a person, according to the Psalms, lives 70 years. And if you make it to 83, 13 more years, it's like, you're a 13-year-old again. So that's one of the ways the tradition encourages us to kind of make up something new. Janice wrote down retirement. Perfect example. We think about retirement as a secular experience, but those of you that have been retired know what a significant, huge transformation it is, and how thinking about retirement and planning for retirement, and then acknowledging the spiritual dimensions of retirement, become possible. What is the role of a synagogue? You all are connected to a synagogue, and it sounds like from my conversation with Susan that you are doing a wonderful job paying attention to people in this age cohort, as opposed to my congregation, where people in your age cohort felt they weren't being seen. Susan was telling me about all the different things that you have: the joyful living, the empty nesters, the boomers, the prime timers. You're doing very well. I speak at a lot of synagogues, and not that many are paying attention the same way that you all are. So good for your clergy, but really good for you for wanting to be seen. Because you're connected to the synagogue, the fear of becoming invisible. You're not invisible. You are seen. If something happens in your life, and on a Friday night, your clergy say, share with us something that happened this week, that's a way of your being visible. So you're doing great. And there's more probably that you could think about. Let me read you a little section from the book. The book does not script these rituals. It just raises the question of what are some of the moments that you might want to acknowledge, and how to make it feel Jewish. How do you create a ritual? How do you think about who should be there? What's the setting? Are there prayers? Is there music? Do you go to a mikveh? Do you light candles? Those kinds of questions are asked, and again, we don't tell you what to do, but we encourage you to think about it. So here's something that I think captures what I'm saying. Saying goodbye to the house where you raised your children isn't easy, but it's easier if you actually say goodbye. Our daughter, her boyfriend, my husband, and I walked through the rooms of our home, stopping in each one to share good memories and to honor the room for its service. After our journey through time, space, and love, we shed a few tears, toasted the house, and sent it on its way to shelter and protect a new family. Before this ritual, we were stuck, painfully holding on to the house we had built 27 years before when our daughter was born. But after the ritual, we felt joy and contentment as we realized how rich those years had been and how ready we were to let go and move on. An unforeseen benefit is that our daughter's boyfriend now feels more connected to the life and history of our family and says he can't wait to be part of the new memories we make together in our condo. We can't wait either. So that's an example of a moment that some of us will experience, not all, moving from the homes where we raised our families, if we did, or, how do you make that transition? Some years ago, I got a call from a congregant. Rabbi, my brother and I are on our way to dismantle my mother's house. We're moving her into a nursing home. What's the prayer you say when you dismantle your mother's house? And I said, yes, there should be a prayer. And we came up with a prayer, and they said a prayer as they began this work, and later reported that it transformed what would have been a chore into a sacred moment. So I think that suggests to us that this is worth thinking about, and for those people lucky enough to be connected to a congregation, to ask the question, how can the congregation help you do this? Another example, I live in Los Angeles, where driving is really important. Not now because nobody's going anyplace, but we don't have a great public transportation system here in LA. And the decision to give up your keys because it's no longer safe to drive is a really difficult decision. And it's mostly associated with loss. People feel shame, they don't want to do it. It's only about loss. What if we were able to transform that experience from one of loss to one of wisdom? That somebody who is wise enough to know when it's no longer safe to drive should be applauded, should be considered a role model, should be celebrated, and take what is normally understood as loss and transform it into, this is about wisdom. What would that look like? And then what is the responsibility to, let's say, the synagogue, to make sure that without driving, you still can get to shul? That, in other words, other systems of connection and transportation and driving each other, and go-go grandparents, and which is a way for people that don't use smartphones to still call Uber and Lyft. Those kinds of opportunities need to be shared, and people need to know about them. So the thing about ritual is it not only helps us notice what's important and the creation of a community around what's important, but it also can help us think differently about some of the transitions that are very much a part of this stage of our life.
Speaking about transitions, back at the beginning of the pandemic, my husband bought Marie Kondo's book, which you actually reference toward the end of your book. And for those of you who are not familiar with this book, it is basically advice on how to declutter in many ways. And after having inherited from two different family members who passed on within months of each other, and our own clutter that we already had, my husband and I were getting overwhelmed. So we started using the pandemic as an opportunity to declutter our home so that we felt more comfortable in it, but also realizing with less activities going on, how we want our lives to be decluttered and remain decluttered once we go back to whatever normal life we're going back to afterwards. So I'm curious, how would the book have been different if you had written it, or at least a chapter of it, after the pandemic began? And also, how do you see the need for community to be, and the availability to be a part of a community. How do you see that that has changed now since the pandemic began?
Well, it turns out that although the book was written before the pandemic began, it actually is more relevant than ever because so many of the issues related to growing older are heightened by the pandemic. The first is ageism. There's no question that we live in a world where, youth is valued and growing older is considered to be an illness. It's a bad thing. Nobody wants to admit they're growing older. And I think a lot of us were living in the fantasy or pretending that we weren't really growing older. 70 is the new 50 is a way of saying I'm really not growing older. What's happened because of the pandemic is that we can't pretend anymore that we're not growing older. Anybody over 60 has been, labeled vulnerable, and we know that in some ways that's true. So we can't pretend anymore. That's one way that the pandemic has really changed the experience, I think, or the truth of growing older. The second is so it's not only ageism out there, but it's internalized ageism, our own inability to be willing to say we're growing older, and we sometimes want to ask for help, but don't do it. I mean, one of the things that always surprises me is Los Angeles International Airport has a lot of corridors. And if you have any difficulty walking at all, it's not a good airport to be in. Many people that I know at various times in their life could benefit from using a wheelchair. They're recovering from surgery or walking is difficult or whatever. And it makes the experience of being in an airport in those days when those people still flew much easier, but people were unwilling to ask for that kind of help because of shame of getting older. That's an example, I think, of internalized ageism. So there's ageism and there's internalized ageism. The second thing is that the pandemic really raised the issue of the tension between generations. Many of you remember that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a meme on social media where the pandemic was called #BoomerRemover. That is to say, oh, this is going to get rid of old people. We don't need them anymore. And people were actually talking about that kind of question about the value of people's lives as we grow older. So that's a scary thing. It raised those issues in a way that they had been underground before, but now they were sort of in the discourse. At the very same time, the need for intergenerational and multi-generational connections had never been more urgent. I would never have survived the beginning part of the pandemic when I didn't go shopping if I didn't have a stepdaughter here in Los Angeles who would go shopping for me. And some of you know that, friends have had adult children and grandchildren move back into your homes because we need each other differently. So the issue of generational connections and the possibility of changing the way we think about generational connections is an opportunity that was presented by the pandemic. And if I were writing the book now, I would be writing about it more. Our tradition speaks about l'dor vador, from generation to generation. I don't think that that's really true. I think it's dor vador, generation with generation. It's not just that wisdom flows from me to the next generation, but wisdom is a circle and it comes back and forth. And for us to be able to imagine how does your synagogue really strengthen those kinds of intergenerational connections, not just in families, but in the community, because again, not everybody has children and grandchildren, and not everybody who does have children and grandchildren have wonderful relationships with them. And I think, it's important for us to name that. When we speak about this group of us, boomers and beyond, we're not one group. Some of us are married and some of us are not. Some of us have kids and grandkids, some of us don't. Some of us are disabled and some of us are not yet disabled or not yet dealing with illness. Some of us have real financial concerns, and others of us have discretionary time and resources. Some of us are straight, some of us are gay. All of the diversity of this group also needs to be acknowledged when we imagine making communities where people really feel seen, visible, and are not isolated. Another issue that I would write more about is how real the epidemic of loneliness is. It turns out that before the epidemic, people were beginning to talk about a public health crisis, an epidemic of loneliness. And not just for younger olders, that is to say, active older adults or frail adults, but millennials as well. There was a study in 2004 that 1 in 4 Americans had no one in their life with whom they could confide. Dr. Vivek Murthy, the former United States Surgeon General, who's been appointed to President-elect Biden's COVID team, wrote a while ago, before the epidemic, loneliness and social isolation are associated with a reduction in lifespan similar to that of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity. So if isolation is a problem, it's a much bigger problem now because of the epidemic and because of how we've been trying to manage issues of loneliness when we are sheltering at home. Finally, I think the way the book would be different is that it'd be a lot more about technology. We now know that we would not be surviving this pandemic without technology. And it's been challenging for many of us. We're not digital natives. And how do you learn this new language? So, how do I make sure that you're hearing me on this Zoom call? And it's beyond Zoom. What are the other ways that we can use technology to stay connected to each other? And what about the changes in technology that can make it easier for us, for example, to age in place at home? There's a whole new industry of technological devices that will make it easier for us to stay connected and to stay safe, in the different ways we choose to grow older. So those are all the ways the book would be different. And I can't wait for this pandemic to be over.
I think we all second that feeling. In the first part, especially, there are a number of chapters where you offer practices for just different things. And a number of them I noticed were practices of meditation. And through meditation, which I think for some people is already, meditation is a challenge or something unfamiliar. But through meditation, we go through a step further and actually potentially visit ourselves at an earlier stage in life to give advice, or we visit others with whom we have unfinished business. And I was wondering what you could offer to our fellow congregants tonight where meditation may not be as comfortable, or maybe they've never tried it before, or the thought of visiting themselves at an earlier time period in their lives might be something very unfamiliar.
So the beginning section, Getting Good at Gaining Wisdom, does offer these different spiritual practices. One is meditation, and it's a short little article that you can read that kind of describes what meditation is. And then there are resources, there's just a ton of resources online, podcast classes that people can take and practice. The advantage, or one of the sort of silver lining of the pandemic, is that many of us have more time and can stretch and do things that we might not have paid attention to before or given ourselves permission to try. So if you're curious about it, try it. You can do it in the privacy of your own house and nobody sees. And if there's no success or failure, it's just something to try. There's a section in the book about lifelong learning, all the different ways that, and again, this is before the pandemic, all the different ways, the classes, the the kinds of learning opportunities that are available, some in real time at universities near where we live, and some online. And what we've learned through this pandemic is that you could be spending full time getting the Jewish education you didn't get when you were a kid in religious school. There are so many amazing opportunities to be able to take classes or to, go to talks. And I know that you're doing it because Susan talked about all the different kinds of programs that you have, for example, in your Amram speaker series. I mean, so you know that these things are available. So like this is a time to do something new. Maybe you played ukulele when you were a kid and you could pick it up again. Or maybe you don't know about meditation, but you could try it. Or there's an article about journaling, how you use your own writing to help you think about what's important. Anyway, so again, this is a toolkit. And one of the chapters in the book is actually taken from Reb Zalman Schachter Shlomi's book called From Aging to Saging, which he wrote in, I think, 1995. Reb Zalman was the kind of founder of the Jewish renewal movement. And a lot of what we experience as contemporary Judaism was influenced by him. He was way ahead of his time. And he named this notion of growing older from aging to saging before other people were talking about it. So there's a chapter called, it's called Exercises for Sages in Training. And it's a series of a little wacky exercises that you can do to think about these kinds of questions. One of my favorites is he takes the verse from the 23rd Psalm, the beloved 23rd Psalm. You have set a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And he asks you to imagine setting a table and inviting everybody who ever hurt you to sit at that table in the presence of your enemies and stand in front of each one of them and thank them for what the experience of interacting with them taught you about who you are and what your life means. It's like totally wacko, but it's actually a pretty powerful experience. It's something you could do alone. It's something that a group of you, in your joyful living groups, to try some of those kinds of exercises. I do know that in the joyful living groups, meditation is often a part of it. And so people who have never had the opportunity to learn about meditation often learn that through these joyful living groups that I know you have facilitators in the congregation who are ready and willing to offer new classes.
Indeed. And I'll just jump in there and say you actually heard from two of them tonight, Wendy and Jim. And so if you are interested in more information on those classes that are starting up in December, there was an article in the journal. Also, you can feel free to email me, email Marcia Humphreys, and we can get you signed up or can tell you more. You mentioned that one of the practices is journaling, and then I noticed toward the end when in the chapter about what is our legacy, which is not the exact title, Leaving a Legacy, not a Landfill, that writing is a tool that is used often, and in the legacy part, it's less about what we may be feeling at a time, like journaling is, but more about what do we want to pass on to our loved ones, family or friends, and the journaling or the writing comes in there where we share information about some of the things we're passing on. So I ask you, as we age, we think increasingly about our legacy. How can we leave a lasting testament of our values with our family and the community and the nonprofits that we care about?
So the last section of the book is getting good at giving away. And there are 4 things that we give away. One is our money. One is our stuff. One are our stories. And one is our values. Now, they're not necessarily separate, but in the book, we treat those separately. The bad news for everybody, sort of Susan mentioned this in passing, and that is our kids don't want our stuff. You know, what do we do? What do I do with my grandmother's hutch that came from Boston, was schlepped across the country, and has been in my home? One kid lives in Boston, one kid lives in Portland. They'll never be, you know, it's not, they're not going to want it. What do I do with it? You know, who do I leave it to? How do I think about my stuff? So partly that's about decluttering, but partly it's about trying for me to understand what the value of that is to me, not in terms of I'm talking about giving away stuff. Our kids don't want our stuff. What do we do with all of those, you know, with the gifts that we got from our parents or our grandparents? So one of the things that is suggested in the book is that it really isn't my grandmother's hutch that matters to me. It's my grandmother and the memory of my grandmother. So recognizing that my children will never want her hutch, what I could do instead is take a picture of that hutch and tell my children the story of why it meant so much to my grandmother and why it meant so much to me to have it in my home. And then I could give the hutch to somebody who could actually really use it. And I think that that would actually make my grandmother happy. So recognizing that this is an issue and figuring out a way to deal with it. And again, in the book, one of the suggestions is to go around from thing to thing and tell the story and keep the image, and then you don't need to keep the stuff. So that's one of the ways of dealing with stuff. The issue about money, we asked Andres Bokorny, who is the head of the Jewish Funders Network, to write the section about strategic giving. And it's interesting that when we were writing the book, we used the word philanthropy. And our publishers didn't like that word because to them it meant rich people. Whereas Andres Bokorny said all of us as Jews are philanthropists. Some of us give away tons of money and some of us give away a little bit of money, but all of us give tzedakah. And what he suggests is that we be strategic about how we do it and talk about the values that go behind the money that we're going to be giving away. Most of us have last wills and testaments, but how much is the issue of values and where we want our money to go, how does that play? So like for Richie and me, we have between us 4 kids. We made a decision that we would divide our estate, which isn't going to be very big, but you know, there'll be some money presumably, into 5 sections. And each kid gets a fifth, and there's a fifth left over for them to decide together where that money goes. And the advantage of that for us is that, first of all, it keeps these kids connected to each other. Again, they didn't grow up together, so they're not necessarily close. But also thinking about what kinds of values are represented in the decisions we make about our charitable giving. So to be intentional, I think part of leaving a legacy is to be thoughtful about what is the legacy we want to leave. The third section is about stories, and it talks about how you actually capture the stories of somebody you love. And technically, you know, what kind of a camera do you need and how is it edited and what kind of questions and all of that. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that now. You can hire somebody to come and do a video, or you could do it with your phone. Thanksgiving is a really good time to begin to collect those stories. For those of you that are women, the Jewish Women's Archive has Story Aperture, where they invite younger generations to interview folks in our age cohort to tell a story about who we are, and we send it to the Jewish Women's Archives, and it's archived, and someday somebody will see it. It's part of somebody's PhD dissertation or whatever. So the stories that we want to keep, and for some it's actually writing a memoir. lots of memoir classes that you can be taking now. It's a way of linking journaling and writing and storytelling. And finally, there's the tradition of values and the Jewish tradition of writing an ethical will. Turns out that from the beginning of Jewish history, starting with Jacob upon his deathbed, speaking blessings to his children, throughout Jewish tradition, there have been ethical wills where people actually leave in writing their values and their hopes for the next generation or the people that they love. It's very powerful. Lots of good resources started in the Jewish community, and now Christians and Muslims and lots of other people, including secular people, are writing ethical wills. You can go to ethicalwill.com online and you'll see a boilerplate for how to write an ethical will. Or you can invite your joyful living folks to offer a class on how to write an ethical will, and you can do it as part of the congregation.
Wonderful, thank you. I would like to thank Rabbi Geller for joining us. We do have one more question, but just I want to make sure that we put the link to her prayer book, to her guidebook, which could be considered a prayer book, right? There are prayers in there, in the chat one more time. It is a really fabulous resource, and I know that our Joyful Living facilitators are already speaking about how we can use this alongside the Wise Aging book that we use for Joyful Living, because there are so many wonderful practical ideas in here. I know it's not actually written for me. I'm only in my 40s. But actually, I find that there are many things in there I already do, and which makes me feel good about the place I'm at. But also, to be thinking ahead I found it so helpful. So I do encourage you to look into this, to purchasing this book. So one final question, Rabbi. The final question actually comes from one of our facilitators, who we heard from earlier, Wendy Kosman. And she asked if you could say what is the best way, if there was only one thing that we should incorporate into our lives as the best way to grow old gracefully, what would you say it is?
Well, I think, honestly, the first is to have a sense of humor. And the second is to really develop a sense of gratitude. The truth is, however much we struggle, and believe me, this is not easy, right? Growing older is not easy. It probably beats the alternative. And we have a lot to be grateful for. I mean, even in this pandemic, which none of us could have imagined, you still can stop and notice that there are things for which you're grateful. That doesn't make you feel entitled to them. And it doesn't blind you to how much more difficult it might be for other people, and that therefore we are called to pay attention to the inequality that has been lifted up by what the pandemic has uncovered for us, but that for us to be able to be grateful that we have these extra years and recognize that whatever the challenges are, there are opportunities as well. So it's not a one-word answer, but I think that that's really important. And I do want to say to you, Susan, that the book is for you because you have older people in your life that you love, and you have conversations that you might want to be having with them. And they might not be ready for those conversations, but you might be able to encourage them to do it. And you want to know what it means to honor your parents if you have them. And and the book does speak to, and the truth is, this new stage, which we don't even have a name for. If we had more time, I would ask you, what do you like to be called? Do you like to be called boomers? Do you like to be called seniors? Do you like to be called elders? What do you like to be called? If we can't find a name that we like, there's an invisibility about this whole experience, right? But we are not just naming ourselves. This is a new life stage, and someday my millennial children will be between the ages of 60 and 80. And how we do this, just like with the Jewish catalog, how we were young and we changed the way the Jewish community looked at young people, how we create what it means to grow older in this stage of life is important, not just for us, but for the generations that come after us. 70 is not the new 50. 70 is the new 70. How we do this is really important, not only for ourselves, but in changing the way our community thinks about growing older, our Jewish community and the larger community.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we certainly are looking toward your wisdom. And I thank you for being with us this evening. Rabbi Geller asked that we conclude with the Psalm 92 that we began with. And so as we do that, we do have a closing slide. So I would like to invite our moderator to put the closing slide on there. But once again, thank you to Rabbi Geller and to the Jewish Book Council for bringing us such a wonderful rabbi with words of wisdom and who can share them so beautifully. Thank you. And with that, Psalm 92. Yifrach ke'erez balvanon yiskeh shetulim beveit Adonai mechatzrot Eloheinu yafrichu odinuvun beseva deshenim vera'ananim iyu lehagid ki yashar Adonai tzuri velo avlata bo. Thank you for joining us.